the certain, we need to understand that there are certain keywords which are associated. So when you say that risk-based audit, then it has to always do with the internal and operational controls, high-risk areas. And what is the purpose of it? Because I wanted to find out that what are the high-risk areas, and to find the high-risk areas, I need to understand what are the internal controls implemented by the organizations, what are the operational controls that are implemented by the organization, and what is the overall nature of the business which I am auditing, right? So these are the important aspects that we must be taken into consideration. If you talk about internal controls, the definition given in the study material was, it says was general controls plus the IS control. Now, general control means, like, say, for instance, if I'm entering into a room, there is a gate and there is a guard sitting there. So guard looks at me and he remembers me and he authorizes me. Plus the IS control, information system control, means I need to use my biometric card to ensure that I am being permitted inside. IS controls are basically IT application control plus IT general control. Now, IT application controls means if I enter the room and start using a particular system, then I need to have a login, I need to have a password. That's an IT application control. IT general control means, as I said, when I entered the lab, then I need to be authorized to enter into the particular premises or particular room. Now, controls, as I have mentioned earlier, that you need not to remember those words. We have seen the words policies, procedures, practices. These are all basically part of control. Now, policies means that you can only enter. There is a word called security policy, which says that the user can use the password for 4 days. That's a policy, right? Procedure, that you will log into the system, then you will use the password. That's a procedure. And there is a practice. That's a normal practice, is that if you are inside the computer room, then you need not leave the system for 2 minutes or 3 minutes blank. मैंने आप system के आगे से 2 minutes से ज़्यादा हट नहीं सकते, because somebody else might can access to your system. ये क्यों करते हैं? Because the purpose is to ensure that, give the business assurance that the objective for which the business is being designed will be achieved without any disturbance, right? We move to the next slide. Now, types of control. Now, again, these are the words, when we read it in the study material, we find it very difficult as to what are these words for. But there is another simple way. Preventive control means they will not do anything, but they will prevent it. How will you prevent it? You will predict it. Like, say, for instance, COVID-19, is going on, pandemic. So there are preventive measures. Now, preventive measures means these are predictive, that make sure that you are washing your hands, things like that, whatever. They are preventing from the problem before it arises by monitoring the operations and input. Now, they say that, these days we find a lot of traffic police there who are watching us, that if you are not wearing masks, they will put a fine onto you. These are all basically preventive controls. Now, detective control means that is, COVID-19 test that, sample testing is being done because they wanted to detect and report the occurrence. So detective will talk about the occurrence. If something has happened, this control will check about the occurrence of this. That is, it will trace the source. Now, remember the audit trails, that if you take withdraw cash more than 10,000 or 15,000 rupees, from 20,000 rupees from, so there is an audit trail that will go back to this trail, tracing the source, that why did you need that? Corrective control. Now, this is important because this reduces or minimizes the impact of the threat. They offer solution to the problem discovered by the detective control. Example, I wanted to take the backup of the system. So now when I take a backup of the system, that is, I am trying to minimize it. Now, this is the last slide. I mean, you can read it, that IS audit function should ensure its objectivity and independence, and its function is decided by the audit committee. Now, finally, if you talk about the takeaway, risk is the product of probability and impact. Now, probability is a statistical word, that is the likelihood, and impact is basically the magnitude. So remember the formula, risk is equal to probability into impact. Now, how the risk assessment is done, मैंने आपको पहले भी कहा था, as an IS auditor, we need to identify the information assets. We need to identify risk. For these assets, what are the vulnerabilities and what are the possibilities of threats? I need to do impact analysis of the risk, that is qualitative as well as quantitative, that if this particular vulnerability is exposed or being threat as being attacked, then what will be the impact of this on risk on my organization? Based on that, I need to prioritize the risk, that is in the terms of high, medium, and low. Once I have done this, then on this criteria, the prioritization of the risk, I will try to assess the control. That is, the controls for the high risk area need to be monitored very carefully, medium next, and the low one, it can be ignored, and accordingly apply appropriate control measures. So, agar hum risk, if we are talking about the risk elements, do remember in the examination two words, vulnerabilities and the threats. Vulnerabilities are internal weaknesses, threats are external. Anything which is internal can be controlled. If anything happens within the, as I gave the example, the door locking one, I could have locked it more properly. This is in my control. But if thief is going to come and invade my house, that's not in my control because that's external. So vulnerability is weakness or a gap in protection efforts. Example, software program which we are using has got a weak code, missing antivirus, firewall, we have left certain gateways open for the unauthorized access, weak access control. Vulnerabilities are internal, as I said, and they can be controlled. Weaknesses means vulnerabilities. So finally, if you want to talk about in terms of what is the risk, it has got the product, that means multiplication of what is the value of the asset, information asset, obviously. Then what is the level of vulnerabilities and what are the possibilities of the threat. So risk final definition is A into B into T. Finally, if you talk about the risk, there are 5 types of risk, which says, there were questions on this also directly asked. Inherent risk is the gross risk or risk before the control. Now, any risk, inherent risk, any business which is running has got certain element of the risk. Before information system audit, you must have studied about the business risk and the financial risk. Now, business risk was, in pure terms, it says fluctuations in profit because of fluctuations in sales. And financial risk, fluctuations in profit because of the amount of debt sources of funds we are using, interest ke burden ki wajah se. Now here inherent risk means you do anything. The moment you talk in terms of business, the type of risk which is associated is basically your gross risk, and that is your inherent risk. Inherent means I'm inheriting, I'm getting it without of my choice. I do not, I have no choice about it. Just we have seen that business risk is a type of a risk which is invariably there, but financial risk is in our choice. If I do not use a debt fund, I will not go for financial leverage and I will not have the financial burden. Similarly, the next is the residual risk. It is that net risk or the risk after the control. So which means residual risk is the risk after we have implemented the control, still there is a certain amount of risk left, that is called as residual risk. Now, many questions are asked from here, which is detection risk. Now, detection risk is basically where auditor fails to detect a material misstatement in the financial statement. Now, obviously, the point is, if I'm checking the controls on a very minuscule basis, like say, for instance, there are 40 controls implemented, I just checked once, only one control, and I've given the report that the rest of the systems are working properly. Here, the element of detection risk is very high because I have not checked all those controls, and I'm issuing a statement saying that which finally has an effect of misstating the financial statement. Next is the controlled risk that may not be detected or corrected or prevented by internal controls. Now, these are the risks which are there, which cannot be detected. Like say, for instance, if a person who deliberately I do certain misstatement, or deliberately as an employee I do certain activities with the figures in the organization, now these are not definitely part of the detection risk or the residual risk, so they are considered to be the controlled risk. Now these risks may not be detected or corrected or prevented by internal controls. So which is the most important risk for the auditor? They have to be very sure about the control risk. So if you talk in terms of what is the final audit risk, it talks about inherent risk multiplied by control risk multiplied by detection risk. Now audit risk is issuance of incurrent audit opinion to audited financial statement. Now these you have to read it. There is no shortcut for it that I can give you a solution for it. But what I'm trying to say is residual name itself. You read the word residual, right click the word, select the synonyms, and you will find that anything which is left after. Detection, select the word, right click. I'm not saying select the whole word. You select only detection and you'll find a synonym for it. Similarly, the last point is the risk matrix. It is a matrix itself, in the sense it has got grid. It's a type of grid where you find rows and columns, and where I'm going to use visualization pattern for understanding and using color schemes for understanding the level of risk. For high, I use red or orange color. For medium, I use orange, maybe lighter shade of the red, and then for the low one, I use the green. So it shows diagrammatically the severity of the risk aligned with the severity of probability and impact. Mane, first is what is the severity, that is the level of risk, and then there is high, medium or low. I'll be deciding on the basis of the severity of the probability. Probability means likelihood. Iske ho jane ke chances kya hain? Based on that, I decide whether the risk is high or low. I'll read, you say that if the probability is low and the impact, if the probability is low as well as the impact is low, I'll consider it to be as low risk. If the probability or likelihood of happening that particular event is high and the impact is also high, then I will consider it to be the high risk. We have finally come to the point where we'll now do some practice questions. So I would appreciate if you could read the questions carefully. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay. IS Auditor identified certain threats and vulnerabilities in a business process. Next, an IS Auditor should, what the auditor should do. Option A, identify stakeholder for the business process. Now, when I say first one, it says, if you realize IS Auditor has identified certain threats and vulnerabilities. When can threats and vulnerabilities be identified? Only if the assets have been identified. Am I right? Am I right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I cannot identify threats and vulnerabilities generally. So first I need to make a list of the assets, and for those assets I have to find out what are the vulnerabilities and what are the threats. So when I have made the list of the assets, then what I have done, I must have already found out who are the stakeholders for the business processes. माने जो 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 इन assets को इस्तेमाल कर रहे होंगे उनके बारे में मुझे पता ही होगा कौन लोग इस्तेमाल कर रहे होंगे, because on that basis I will be identifying the threats and vulnerabilities. Am I right? Option B
Yes,
says
sir.
identify information asset and underlying system. Third, disclose the threats and impact to the management. And fourth, identify and evaluate the existing control. Now, what should be the answer according to you? Anyone?
So D must be done.
Identify and evaluate the existing control. Because option second also, if you look into it, finding out information assets and then underlying system, ये तो पहले ही करा होगा. Only then you can move on to the next step of identifying the threats and vulnerabilities. Disclose the threats and impact to the management. What will happen with this? It will not happen nothing. It's not a part of disclosing. Is that you need to check the controls which are already there. So as an explanation is, an IS auditor is largely expected to evaluate the existing control. Now, as I already mentioned, you identify the assets, find out vulnerabilities and threats. Then what you do, assess the control, evaluate the control, and find out their effectiveness. However, the last D point, the disclosure of threats and impact to the management, you can do it later on. That's not a point. Second, most important step in risk analysis is to identify what? Is to identify
vulnerabilities.
Wonderful, wonderful. Now, as I
Vulnerabilities.
said, right, vulnerabilities are the weaknesses in protection efforts. Now, if you realize, if I'm doing analysis, I need to basically find out where my weaknesses are. Weaknesses, another word they've given is vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities, always remember, are internal and these are controllable. I can control them. Relevancy of audit planning depends on the identification of vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are key element in conduct of risk analysis. So from what we conclude, when we do risk analysis, vulnerability is an important aspect. In a risk-based audit planning, an IS auditor's first step is to identify responsibility of the stakeholders, high-risk area within the organization, cost center, and the profit center.
High risk.
High risk areas.
Critical step in risk-based audit process is to identify the high-risk area, as I have mentioned, if you remember. The high-risk area is done for determining the size to perform the nature and extent of testing. So next is when developing risk-based audit strategy, an IS auditor should conduct a risk assessment to ensure. Now, if you read these questions carefully, they are trying to use words again and again. Like in this question, if you find twice the word risk has been used, which might give an impression, one is talking about risk-based audit, the other is talking about the risk assessment. So what I request you all is, most of the mistakes happen because we do not spend time in reading the question. So don't jump onto, and the point is there are so many questions and they've given all the options in front of us. We jump onto this conclusion. Even I do the same mistake, several times. So I appreciate that you should read the questions carefully and try to frame it out what the question is asking. So it says when developing a risk-based audit strategy, that means you are planning about the IS audit. An IS auditor should conduct risk assessment. And why you are conducting risk assessment? Because you wanted to ensure what? The first is segregation of duties to mitigate risk is in place. Could be. All relevant vulnerabilities and threats are identified. Great. Regularity compliance is adhered to. That means people are following the standards and business is profitable, obviously. All the relevant vulnerabilities and threats are identified. Now, when I'm talking in terms of risk assessment, again, the two words are there which we should remember. Vulnerabilities and threats are identified. I'll just give you again back. Over here, we have said that we are trying to do this so that we can find out the high risk areas so that our vulnerabilities are all identified and done. So next question comes when developing risk-based audits. I've already done that, I think. Next is major advantage of risk approach for audit planning is. Now read it. Major advantage of risk-based approach. I'm talking about instead of risk-based approach, we can say IS audit for audit planning. Now, what is the purpose of IS audit? If you remember, our options are audit planning can be communicated to the client in advance. Yes, it can be. But now you have to see the word is used the major advantage, or that means all of them are advantages. But out of them, which one is the major advantage? Second, audit activities can be completed within allotted budget. It's great enough. And use of latest technology for audit activities, that's also part of it. And appropriate utilization of resources for high-risk areas.
D, appropriate utilization of resources.
D,
for
yeah.
Wonderful.
High-risk areas.
Yeah. The risk-based audit approach ensures that audit time is spent on the highest, on the areas that are with the high risk. So which means that if I have to do IS audit, I need to focus on high-risk area. While determining the appropriate level of protection for an information asset, an IS auditor should primarily focus on. Now remember, try to understand while determining appropriate level of protection. So that means I have identified the information assets. Now I'm talking in terms of how do I protect those information assets. So what should, if I'm trying to do so, what should I focus on? Number one, criticality of the information assets, cost of the information assets, owner of the information assets, and result of vulnerability assessment. Now, this is a tricky question. Why I'm saying so? Because as an IS auditor, they are asking me primarily means, again, you must be, what I'm trying to give you an idea is, if you realize, these are all questions from their past exam. Now, they use the word primarily. Now, primarily means largely. Largely means the main focus would be on what? So can anyone of you can decide the answer?
Yeah, it would be either A or D. I think it may close to A.
Criticality of information asset.
A, criticality of information asset.
What we have done is we have done this information assets. Then we have listed the information assets. Then we have to find out vulnerabilities and threat. Then we have talked about the likelihood and the impact. So when I say likelihood and the impact, then this decides the criticality. If it is very, very critical, then I should design the control accordingly. So the level of protection for an asset is determined based on the criticality of the assets. Factors, all the rest of the factors are basically, they're considered. Now we talk about the list. We are just finally about to conclude in another 5 minutes. The decisions and action of an IS auditor are most likely to affect which of the following risk? You should answer this. You should be able to do that.
Detection.
Right. Detection. Inherent risk which comes with the business. Detection is the risk where an auditor fails to detect a material misstatement in the financial statement, right? The risk of IS auditors certifying existence of a proper system and a procedure without using an inadequate test procedure is an example of. Again, this is very simple. I am certifying it without using proper procedure for testing the entire sample. So what could be the reason for what type of risk I am trying to do it, commit it? Anyone?
Detection only.
The last
Just
question,
audit risk.
right? An auditor who certifies the existence of a proper system without
Audit
checking,
risk.
right? So you are trying to do is detection risk. Overall business risk for a particular threat can be expressed as, now again, this is a very, now when I'm talking about the overall, now here they're saying that talking about the inherent risk of the business, right? So how do you define inherent risk? Number one, a product of probability and the impact, B, probability of occurrence, C, magnitude of impact, and D, assumption of the risk assessment team. It is a product.
A, product of probability and impact.
The criticality, and this criticality will define the overall business risk. So if you look into it, A gives the likelihood and the magnitude of the impact, whereas B gives the likelihood, and the C only gives the consideration to the magnitude of damage. Remember always, vulnerabilities are internal weaknesses that can be exploited by the threats which are external. So as an IS auditor is evaluating management risk assessment of information system, the IS auditor should first review what? Now, when you are trying to do the risk assessment, you started the IS audit, you're first trying to assess the risk of the information system, what you should be doing it. Number one, you should review the control already in place. You should review the effectiveness of the controls in place. You should review the mechanism for monitoring the risk related to the assets, and you should review the threats and vulnerabilities affecting the assets. Now, this is again a dicey question because there are 2 or 3 questions options which are very closely related. Options are related. May I know the answer, please?
D, threats or
Threats and
vulnerabilities.
vulnerability. Since first review is the keyword first.
You look into it. What I'm trying to say is an IS auditor is evaluating the management risk assessment of information system. Now, in this process, IS auditor should first review what? I mean, the control already in place. Ye ho sakta hai. The effectiveness of the control in place. Are these control effective? That's again a part of it. But when you are trying to do the assessment, the first thing is you need to identify vulnerabilities and the threat that are going to affect the information assets. So these are the 2 important factors we must remember. Risk is nothing but vulnerabilities and threats. These are the 2 elements. An IS auditor is reviewing data center. Now, data center means that is a location which is separate. I mean, the place where normally offices do not try to keep the data with themselves. They try to maintain a data center separately where the entire information, like say for instance, Amazon has a separate data centers in different countries, and though they follow the cloud-based system. So as an auditor, when you are reviewing the data center security, which are the following steps would IS auditor normally perform first? Now I am doing audit of a data center of an Amazon. So I will be going to that very location physically and to check the security purposes of the data center. Then what should I do first? Number one, evaluate physical access control, determine the risk and threats to the data center site, C, review screening process of the hiring staff, and D, evaluate logical access control. Which should be the correct answer?
E.
Right?
E, risk or threats to data.
Right, because the point is when you are moving to the data center for the first time, you're responsible to find out what are the external, like say for instance, if it is located in an area like which is prone for flood. Now that's an external area, but the data center site located. Now particular area where a data center site is there, which is prone for riots. So these are all basically the risk and the threats. Now I have not used the word vulnerabilities over here. You remember the risk and the threats because we are talking about external. Had this answer, I changed this option to determine the vulnerabilities and threats to the data center side, it will not be the correct answer. I'm talking because you are saying auditor is reviewing data center security and he should normally perform first. That means when he is visiting the data center for the first time, he should see that where the location of the data center is and things like that. Risk assessment approach is more suitable when determining the appropriate level of protection for an information asset because again, read it again. Now the question is, as you find, there are one-liner questions and then there are 4-liner questions. So For such questions, I request and appeal to you all, read it again. Risk assessment approach, basically a part of risk audit, basically a part of IS audit, is more suitable. Now, again, the word is more suitable when determining appropriate level of protection for an information asset because it ensures means it guarantees means it gives you assurance all information assets are protected, number one. Second, a basic level of protection is applied regardless of the asset value, should not be considered. Appropriate level of protection is applied to the information assets, and only most sensitive information assets are protected. What are the one? Could be the answer. Since again I might be running short of time, so I'm giving the answer. Right? The appropriate level of protections are now based on risk assessments. Assets are classified according to the criticality. That is, which asset is more critical, which is not very less critical, and on that basis of criticality, the security is being given. Now, in a risk-based audit approach, an IS auditor should first complete inherent risk assessment, controlled risk assessment, test of control assessment, and substantial test assessment. Now, as I use the word inherent risk is basically the business risk, which is the total risk. So how do I understand the business risk? Say, for instance, I'm going to audit my company, which I'm going to do the audit, say, for instance, is the banking industry. So I need to see that what are the risks to which a banking industry is exposed. And then I need to compare those bigger scale of risk with the particular bank which I am going to do the IS audit. So when I say I am going to audit an retail, my company belongs to a retail industry, it has got a different level of inherent risk. When I say my audit is from a banking industry, it has a different inherent risk level. So all these things can be understood if you understand the nature of the business as well as the industry to which it belongs. Now remember, now see this risk assessment process is subjective, objective, mathematical, and statistical. Remember, I have mentioned in the earlier notes over here also. So if you remember,
statistical.
It is?
Yeah. Statistical.
No, risk assessment is not statistical, dear. It is subjective. I have mentioned that also earlier. That subjective in the sense, if I say if I am assessing the risk of a particular bank and you are assessing risk for a particular bank, I carry a 30 years of an experience of an audit of a banking industry. So my level of understanding of risk based on my experience as compared, maybe you have a better experience in the retail industry and I do not have that exposure in the retail industry. So my assessment of risk for the retail industry would be much lesser as compared to that of yours. So risk assessment is a perception of the risk officer. How do you perceive? So there are no definite mathematical or statistical formula for risk assessment. Agar aap dekho to, why do we face this COVID position? Because we could not anticipate or could not predict, could not assess that this could be the magnitude of the pandemic. But we realize now we are prepared for it. So because now even for the dengue fever, people are very careful about it. If the risk assessment could have been done properly, the control measures could have been initiated in a much better way. Am I right? The ultimate result of risk management process is used for, now when I am talking about I'm not talking about risk assessment. Risk management is a bigger term. Risk management covers the entire spectrum of the process. Number one, I'll be using it for forecasting profit. I'll be using post-implementation review. I'll be using it for designing control, or I will be using it for acceptance testing. Now, acceptance testing in the sense, I'll be giving it to user that you can use this and you can software, I mean, the system which is being designed when accepted by the user is part of the user testing. Anyone who can answer this?
Yeah, C, designing controls.
Wonderful. It's like the objective of risk management process is to ensure the identified risks are managed by designing various controls, right? So we move ahead. Managing the risk up to acceptable level is the responsibility of. That's a great question. Now, normally we get confused about it. Now, if you look into it, they're talking about who is the owner of the risk, who would take the responsibility, who is ultimately answerable for the risk, which is organization.
Organization.
Organization. Which one is the correct answer out of this?
B.
Now, the point is, if I'm running the business, then who's responsible for bearing the losses or the risk? It's me who's responsible. So the rest of the option, if you look into it, these are the people who will be reporting to the management. So it is the senior business management, the board of the directors, the board of the governors, chairman. These people are responsible for managing the risk up to an acceptable level because these are the people who will define what is the risk appetite. These are the people who will define what is the residual level of risk which they are going to, which they are willing to take it, right? So it is the answer is senior business management. The senior business managements are accountable for management of risk, as they have the ultimate responsibility for the effective and efficient operations of the organization. Which means AC and DR, these are the people who are reporting. An IS auditor is reviewing payroll application. He identified some vulnerabilities in the system. What would be the next task? Now, he identified certain weaknesses in the, now always remember, convert the word vulnerability into weaknesses. That means payroll application is having certain weaknesses. Now, what type of weaknesses could be there? The codes are not very properly written, in the sense there are certain loopholes. Anybody can change the payroll of a particular individual employee or the general employee. So what he should do, report the vulnerability to the management. Report the
Maybe C, sir.
right. It says identify
Could be
threats.
C.
Identify threats.
Identify threats and likelihood of the occurrence, which means there is no point in the rest of the A, B, and D, because if you realize, the IS auditor has to first identify the assets, look for the vulnerabilities, and then identify the threats and the likelihood of the occurrence, that is the probability. So the C says the identify the threats and likelihood of the occurrence. Now, say for instance, if you have identified a threat, but the likelihood of the occurrence is very, very less, negligible, then it is not the part of the criticality, coming under the criticality. But if you find that the likelihood, that is the probability of occurrence, is very high, then it has to be taken care of. Now, absence of proper security measure represent threats, assets, impact, and vulnerabilities. What does the answer is? Anyone?
D.
B?
Maybe vulnerability, sir.
Absence of proper
Vulnerability.
measure represent. Security measures represents. Dear, I have already said it's a weaknesses. Proper security
Yeah, it's a weakness.
I am internally, I should have I have not locked my door properly. That is, I am using improper security measures for locking the door, which means this is an internal and it could have been maintained. Threat is external. Absence of proper security measures, that means it is my responsibility to secure my house. If I'm leaving it like this, then the threats are there that a thief might come in. So vulnerabilities are weaknesses in protection efforts. These are internal and controllable, and they are the important element of risk analysis. Now, IS Auditor is developing a risk management program. The first activity to be performed is, number one, vulnerability assessment, evaluation of control, identification of asset, and gap analysis. Be very careful in this question. Answer, please.
Identification of assets.
Wonderful. See, the point is, here again, they've given the option vulnerability assessment. They've also given the option is evaluation of control. Now, here the word I have bolded, highlighted in bold is the first activity. The first activity always is I need to first basically identify what are the assets which are prone for these vulnerabilities on the threats. So identification of assets to be protected is the first step in development of risk management program. That's IS auditing. This is again a question which I wanted to, avoid it, but still I do not want, I'm sharing with you. Benefit of development of organization policies by bottom-up approach is that now there are two approaches in developing an organization policy. One is the bottom-up approach and the other is the top-down. Now, bottom approach is, you can understand, दीवार को खड़ा करने के लिए क्या करते हैं? Brick by brick, I am laying it, right? So when I finally conclude, so what I'm trying to do it, bottom-up approach, I'm trying to, starting from the grassroots level. And when I say top-down approach, that means I start building the entire wall, and the entire block of the wall is being put over where the wall is supposed to be created. So there are two different approaches. One is top-down, the other is bottom-up. So bottom-up goes with brick by brick. Top-down means the entire log of the portion of the creation will be done, and then it is filled. Which one do you think is better? Don't talk in terms of top-down or bottom-up. Dono approaches में से which one do you think should work better? I'll give the answer. As it is, if you realize that bottom-up approach is basically
Bottom-up would work better.
Better, because now you are one by one, and you will ensure that all of them are fitting, all the points are fitting it properly, right?
Yeah.
Right. So, but if you lay down a top-down approach, it's a holistic view, definitely good one. But again, top-down is for developing organizational overall policies. That is, now I have different departments. These departments can connect with each other. For that, I need a top-down approach, but for an individual level of policies, I need to see the bottom approach. So the answer, these are B's, that is, they are derived as a result of risk assessment. Now, risk can be mitigated. Now, when I use the word mitigated, anyone can answer what does mitigation means?
Reducing the risk, not 100%. Reducing.
Totally control it.
Right.
Get
You are
Reducing to some extent.
You are trying to reduce it. So if you are implementing control, you are not removing the risk, but normally look at it, insurance is there, audit and certification and service level agreement. But if you realize risks are mitigated means diminished, reduced by implementing appropriate security control and practices. Insurance is basically a mechanism of transferring the risk to the third party, right? Audit and certification are mechanism of risk assurance. If an auditor certifies and audit gives a clean report, says that all controls are working properly, it gives an assurance that is guaranteed to the management that my system is correct, right? Contracts and service level agreements are mechanism for risk allocation. Now, say for instance, normally आप देखते होंगे कि your product is under warranty. What does it mean? There is an agreement between the purchaser and the seller that if something goes wrong, that you will try to look after the your asset which I have purchased it from you. That's basically I'm allocating the risk to that third party. Most important factor while evaluating control is to ensure that the control addresses the risk, does not reduces productivity, is less costly than risk, and is automative. All of them are basically part of the
Addresses the risk.
right.
Address the risk.
Addresses the risk is the correct answer. I'm moving ahead because I might run short of time and they will again throw me out. Or these are the questions which
1 minute to 1 minute left.
yeah. So these are the one which I do not want. So this is what I have done it for. This session, I believe. So I hope you all find it helpful, and I'm confident that this is the material which I will be. If you realize today what we've done is the concept of audit. These are the parts which were taken from the study material. There's another chapter 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. A small summary notes of it. These are the challenging concepts that we have done today. These are the explanation which I have tried to put it in front of you. My screen is visible?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
sir.
Right. So, okay, fair enough. So these are the small notes. I have done it. Then you can all these the way they've been highlighted. So I'll be sharing it in this group, and that's all. So I am thankful to you all for joining, and I hope this session should give some help to you in your exam preparation. That's it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
The efforts for the
Vinod,
flash
I think yeah, it is a selfless motive from your end.
Yeah, I just feel that I should give back to the profession where I belong.
Yes,
Right?
totally agree.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
So, if you wanted to share your feedback, then you do write to me, and what are the areas where I can still further improve. What I did in this session is that I did not want to repeat again and again the same thing. I'm trying to focus on certain aspects of the things which may be of some sense to you, and I'll be sharing the notes also.
Yes.